Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the fifth program in a series of programs I'm doing on the great French wisdom writer Michel de Montaigne. In my last two programs on Montaigne, I focused on one of his major themes, and that is education. He addresses himself to both educating people in school and also lifelong education. He gives us advice about what we might all do to educate ourselves after our formal schooling ends. Montaigne, in addressing himself to the importance of lifelong education, tells of an old man who was asked why he was still studying diligently in his old age. And the old man responded thusly, "In order to leave the world a better and more contented man." For Montaigne, education was not simply a means to securing a good income, but rather, more importantly, education was a means of learning how to deal with all of the major aspects of daily living. He believed one could have a good income and a good job, but nevertheless flunk life in a sense. And why so? Well, because of many reasons, but among them, perhaps poor judgment in matters affecting one's daily life, and also inappropriate values. He talks a lot about judgment and values in his essays. According to Montaigne, what are the standards he uses to evaluate his own and other people's education? Well, quite briefly, personal growth. That's his chief standard. Specifically, under the heading personal growth are the following: good judgment in everyday matters. Montaigne points out that good judgment will serve us better in life than a good memory. Also, personal growth would involve cultivating the ability to think critically. This, among many things, involves being able to develop the ability to think for oneself and not passively accept the thinking of those around oneself. This involves cultivating self-trust and self-reliance. It also involves habitually questioning the way the majority of people think. Walt Whitman, the famous American poet, I think provides illumination here. He said this: "Re-examine all you have been told in school or church or in any book, and dismiss whatever insults your soul." For Montaigne, among the additional standards by which one can evaluate one's own education are the following: fortitude, endurance. Montaigne believed that life is often difficult and that we must learn to endure. We must learn to endure what we cannot avoid. He also believed that temperance, moderation, is very important in life, and it's one of the standards by which we can judge our own education. And what does he mean by temperance? Well, he means not drinking or eating in excess, not having sex in excess, and not consuming material goods in excess. The Aristotelian maxim, nothing in excess, was very dear to Montaigne and helps explain his thoughts on this particular aspect of judging one's education. What Montaigne is often really writing about is emotional education, emotional intelligence. It's about how to regulate our emotions. For example, anger, fear, envy, desire, sadness. There are people there are people who achieve very high grades in school and graduate from some very prestigious universities, but nevertheless remain emotionally illiterate. And of course, Montaigne attached a lot of importance to self-knowledge. In fact, so much of what I've talked about thus far in enumerating the standards he used to judge one's education come under the heading of self-knowledge. By self-knowledge, Montaigne means, among many things, self-study and self-criticism. Montaigne claims that as a result of self-study and self-criticism, there are times when we should hug ourselves and other times when we should correct ourselves. And of course, Montaigne attached a lot of importance to virtue. Montaigne believed that wisdom is never divorced from virtue. Wisdom is never divorced from virtue. He believed that one cannot be considered to be an educated person if one is not a decent, kind person, regardless of how many degrees one has and regardless of what grades one has gotten. According to Montaigne, a degree from Harvard or Oxford is no guarantee that one is well educated. Here are Montaigne's own words. Education must teach us to follow and embrace virtue and wisdom. Again, education must teach us to follow and embrace virtue and wisdom. One can be confident that many of the people who are at least partly responsible for the economic mess our country is in today graduated from some of the world's most prestigious schools and universities. Some of the greediest and most unethical people, you can be sure, work on Wall Street. According to Montaigne, one should never confuse academic degrees with sincerity, integrity, compassion, emotional intelligence, and even good judgment. Montaigne believed that schools generally do very little to produce graduates who have educated hearts, good hearts. Montaigne, on the benefits of being a just person, said the following, and I think this is pretty provocative and quite interesting. Again, Montaigne's own words. There is indeed a certain gratification when we do a good deed that gives us joy. There is a generous pride which accompanies a good conscience. A very wicked soul cannot provide itself with this contentment. He goes on to say, it is no slight pleasure to say to oneself, a man might look into my very soul, and yet he would not find me guilty of anyone's affliction or ruin, or of revenge, or envy, or of failing to keep my word. These testimonies of a good conscience are pleasant, and such a natural pleasure is very beneficial to us. He continues, it is the only payment that can never fail. Again, the joy we get, the satisfaction we get, the clear conscience we develop as a result of trying to be good people is the only payment, he says, that can never fail. There is a particular sentence so many of the great thinkers use in one way or another, which I think summarizes Montaigne's ideas concerning virtue. And it's this: self-respect is the cornerstone of joy. Self-respect is the cornerstone of joy. I've been talking about Montaigne's standards for evaluating one's education. How different his standards from that of many Americans. We know that many Americans are quite interested in going to prestige schools, and there's nothing really wrong with that. And when I'm talking about prestige schools, I'm not just talking about universities. The New York Times, in the last year or so, has had a series of articles about prestige nursery schools in Manhattan, prestige kindergartens in Manhattan, as well as prestige private schools incorporating grades 1 through 12. And these articles in the New York Times have pointed out that some quite wealthy people in Manhattan will go to great lengths to get their children into these prestige schools, including, as I said, prestige nursery schools. The Times also pointed out that some of these nursery schools and kindergartens have entrance examinations for the children trying to get in to them. Again, how different, I think, the standards of so many Americans when it comes to judging a school than Montaigne's standard. Some letter writer to the New York Times, reacting to this series the Times did on prestige schools, wrote the following. And again, I think this is both interesting and provocative. He wrote this: "Success is measured by the school name and not by the actual education or personal growth. This misdirection forces students to value illusion over reality." By the way, that letter was written by one Luke Wilson to the New York Times. Montaigne believed the most important subject we can study is philosophy. He believed if taught properly, and that's a big if, by the way, if taught properly and studied diligently, it is the best subject for stimulating our thinking about how to live a more satisfying life. Montaigne gets very specific about how philosophy can help us. He talks about how philosophy can assist us in coming to a greater understanding of human nature. Here are his own words. "It is philosophy by which the deepest parts of our nature can be explored." Again, it is philosophy by which the deepest parts of our nature can be explored. He also claims that philosophy can help us to deal with daily hardships. He says this, and again I'm quoting him. "Philosophy can teach us how to avoid or endure certain hardships in life." Also, philosophy can help us come to some understanding of what is true and what is false about so many dimensions of the human experience. For example, philosophy can help us to understand what is true and what is false about life, about human nature, about where to look for tranquility and joy. So many of the great thinkers have claimed that many people look in the wrong places for tranquility and joy, and therefore their lives are not as fulfilling as they could be. The great German philosopher Schopenhauer claimed that we have many illusions, many blind spots, and that most of us, in fact all of us, he claims, will die still having certain illusions and blind spots. And Schopenhauer, like Montaigne, believed that one of the purposes of philosophy was to help disabuse us of certain illusions, was to help us to remove some of the blind spots we have about life and other people, and again, where to look for tranquility. Santayana, a very famous philosopher who taught at Columbia University for many years, I think sums up Montaigne and Schopenhauer very well. He said this: wisdom comes by disillusionment. Wisdom comes by disillusionment. In other words, wisdom comes by freeing ourselves from false ideas. Montaigne put it this way: a good education alters our judgment and character. Montaigne claimed that some philosophers are better than others in helping us to focus on the difficulties of life and what we might all do to deal with them. What I would like to do now is to enumerate some of the philosophers and specific works that I think help very much to help us to better enjoy life. And again, you might want to grab a pencil or a pen and write down some of this information. By the way, some of this is on my website, which you will see at the end of the program. And again, before I begin listing some specific philosophers and certain books, let me quote Epicurus, who I think provides some illumination here. Epicurus, a philosopher of antiquity, said this: vain is the word of a philosopher that does not help to heal any suffering of mankind. So again, Epicurus, like so many of the great philosophers, believed that philosophy's chief function should be to help us live more satisfying lives. Again, now some specific philosophers and books, and the books I'm going to mention are not difficult to read, not particularly. In fact, some of them are pretty easy to read. A book I would highly recommend, well, first of all, the philosopher, Seneca, S-E-N-E-C-A. Seneca was a very famous philosopher of antiquity, and I highly recommend a book he wrote entitled Letters from a Stoic. He was considered to be a Stoic philosopher. That's a particular branch or school, a particular school of philosophy, the Stoics. Again, Seneca and his book, Letters from a Stoic. You can access this book at any good bookstore, and I'm sure virtually any library has it. Another very famous philosopher of antiquity, and one of his books that I highly recommend, Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius. Again, his last name, A-U-R-E-L-I-U-S. Not only was he a famous philosopher, but also a Roman emperor at one time. In fact, many today consider him to have been a philosopher king. In any event, I highly recommend that you buy or go to the library and get Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Meditations, that's capital M-E-D-I-T-A-T-I-O-N-S. Actually, it was his journal. Most days of the year, he would make entries into his journal about what he had experienced that day, and he reflects on what he might have learned that day about life and people, so that in reading his journal, again entitled today, The Meditations, we can also benefit from his wisdom. By the way, some current paperback editions of this book are not entitled Meditations, but something like The Philosophy of an Emperor. In any event, you want to remember his name, Marcus Aurelius. It's the only book, really, that he ever wrote. As I mentioned, it's a journal. So again, ask the person at the bookstore or the library for a book by Marcus Aurelius, and they will direct you to, again, the book that's usually entitled Meditations. Perhaps the most famous philosopher was Plato. Some philosophy professors and other writers about philosophy regard him as being the greatest of all the philosophers. He wrote many books, most of them short, and among my favorite books that Plato wrote, and I think that are especially illuminating and not difficult to read, are the following. The Apology, Apology, Apology. It's about Socrates' trial. Socrates was Plato's teacher, and Socrates, as perhaps you know, was put on trial in ancient Athens. This is a true story, by the way, and sentenced to death as a result of trumped-up charges. In any event, this book is less than 100 pages long, The Apology, and one of the reasons it's so valuable is that it gives one insights into the philosophic mind, so to speak. And again, I think provides great insights about life and about death, by the way. Another famous book by Plato, perhaps his most famous book, is entitled The Republic. The Republic, capital Republic. This is Plato's version of the ideal society. In this book, he tells us what kind of government the ideal society would have, what kind of economic system, what kind of educational system, what would marriage be like, for example, in the ideal society. Again, it's a great book, The Republic. And one other book by Plato, and again, he wrote many books, a book entitled The Symposium. It's also less than 100 pages, and it's about Plato's ideas about love and beauty. Again, The Symposium, capital Symposium. And a very famous book by a 20th century philosopher that's very easy to read and a very valuable book. The philosopher's name is Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, capital Russell. You might recall a couple of years ago I did a series of programs on him. The most important book I think he ever wrote for the layman is a book called The Conquest of Happiness. The Conquest of Happiness. By the way, you might have trouble getting it at a bookstore. I'm not sure it's still in print. Although I think Amazon.com does have it, and my guess is the libraries still have it. It's a great book. Again, it's called The Conquest of Happiness. In this book, Bertrand Russell claims that when he was a very young man, he was on the verge of suicide, habitually on the verge of suicide. But he learned how to become a happier person. And so he wrote this book, again entitled The Conquest of Happiness. Another book I highly recommend by a very famous philosopher, his name is Nietzsche, is a book called Beyond Good and Evil. It's a very stimulating book. It's a real page-turner. You might disagree with much of what Nietzsche says, but I am confident he will hold your attention. At times he will get you angry. At other times you'll find him very satisfying to read. Again, Nietzsche is spelled, this philosopher's name is spelled, capital Nietsze, Nietzsche, and the name of the book is Beyond Good and Evil. It's perhaps his most famous book. And by the way, while Sigmund Freud wasn't a philosopher, but rather a psychiatrist, nevertheless, Freud, like so many of the great philosophers, can provide us with much help in trying to deal with our daily problems. And I think the best book one can read by Freud, a book which provides an overview of his thinking about many things, because he wrote it late in life, is a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. And it's not a long book, and it's not difficult to read. And one final book, if you're interested in reading a survey book of what the great philosophers believed. If you want to read a book which has a chapter on Plato, a chapter on the Stoics, a chapter on the Epicureans, a chapter on St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Wittgenstein. Well, the best survey book of the philosophers I've ever read is a book called The Story of Philosophy by Brian McGee. It's in paperback, by the way. The Story of Philosophy by Brian McGee. That's Magee. Back to Montaigne now. Again, the reason I provided an enumeration and some clarification of those philosophers and their books is that, as I pointed out, Montaigne believed that studying philosophy was the most important thing we could do in life. Montaigne also believed that something else all students should do if they're going to become better educated is to study the various cultures of the world. I think in some high schools today, they entitle the course World Studies. Montaigne believed that to better understand our own culture, we had to study other cultures, that by doing that, we could better understand what are some of the positive aspects of our culture and what perhaps are some of the negative aspects of our culture. Again, by studying other cultures, we can better put our culture in perspective. So that's one of the real benefits of studying the culture of Western Europe, India, China, the Middle East, etc. I see I'm running short on time. I will continue with my discussion of Montaigne and his philosophy, specifically his essays, next week. But right now, as is my custom, I'd like to end with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau believed we are all artists, and in Walden, his masterpiece, he penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."